opened in 2020 on Valentine's Day, and then of course, like the rest of the world, we shut down for a while. But because we connected to the common notion of these publishing hours, we were able to survive and pay rent, keep things going. We are unashamedly left, progressive, internationalist. We have titles that focus on marginalized communities, and for the most part, the titles that we curated focuses on our mission statement, which is creating a new world. So everything that we try and do in our books and our speakers, authors, and wonderful activists that are part of the spaces here are focused on trying to make sure that we address some of the major issues that capitalism has inflicted upon us in multiple ways. So, welcome to Making Worlds. The bottom is on the left back there. Please feel free to bottom whenever you feel like it. You're not getting interrupted in space. We are going to live stream the event tonight, so the camera will focus on our speakers and then may focus on the audience different times. We'll end at the scheduled time of 7:30, but we can go a little bit. If you're comfortable wearing a mask, that's fine. If you don't want to, that's okay. So we have some masks available over there if you need to pick up one. So again, welcome, and
Thank you. So we have decided to chat a little bit about what our books are about as a start, but then we'll do like a little Q&A between us, and then we'll turn it over to you. Of course, we're going to read excerpts from the book and excerpts that relate to both topics of our books. There's a lot of overlap, basically, geographically and thematically. In terms of my book, it's a collection of 7 short stories, and one is the subject of that T-shirt over here. It's called Sharif versus the Party of God. That's the first one, and it's about a 70-year-old woman running out of cigarettes in the 2006 war on Lebanon, where she detains a platoon during the bombing, so that to try to force them to get her cigarettes. The second story is This How You Eat the Watermelon, which I'll be reading from. Oh, should I use the microphone? Yeah, that's better. Which I'll be reading from today is about a hedonistic man by the name of Ghassan that basically is eating and drinking himself to death in Beirut, who is really a stand-in for a city that is dying right now. The Sayyid and the Snow Woman is about a cleric who, on the first snow in South Lebanon, decides to build a snow woman rather than a snowman, and it causes a bit of a scandal. Groom is about a couple that meet or come across an abused monkey, and in Saudi Arabia, in Al-Khobar, Saudi Arabia, and through their interaction with the monkey, they recognize trauma within each of them that they've been subjected to. Killdeer takes place in southern Maryland, and Killdeer is about basically a poet that's given residency in southern Maryland at St. Mary's. You know St. Mary's, Sarah. At St. Mary's, and basically he is, unbeknownst to him, this is another trauma topic. He's actually laboring with trauma and gives birth to a poem, basically. Send My Regards to Your Mother is actually came out of the prison diary of my imprisonment in Bahrain as a political prisoner, as an accused terrorist before I even became political. And the last one, The Birds of Ashrafi, is about a dozen or so kids that are trapped in the birthplace of the Lebanese Civil War, in the birth date of the Lebanese Civil War in April of 1975 for 43 days in a boarding school because they couldn't get out before the barricades, before the checkpoints were set up. And it's a story about these some of these characters that are trapped in the school. So that's how you eat a watermelon. It's a lot about a lot of the themes. Sometimes you write stories and you don't know what the themes are till you finish. And the theme that I see is basically either the characters are consuming life or are being consumed by it. That's how the stories alternate. Yes.
Thanks. And I just want to thank Zein for inviting me to be part of his book launch. My book came out a year ago, so it's old news at this point. And I want to also just say congratulations to Making Worlds. This is a beautiful space. I was here in the fall of 2019 when it was literally a shell. I was walking through sawdust, or something I told myself was sawdust, because there was a book discussion group about Noura Arakat's Justice for Some, which was really great. So it's so nice to be here and see what a beautiful space you've created. So thank you. So my book, The Other End of the Sea, is a novel, and it's essentially a love story. The through line is a love story between Zein and Rebecca. Zein is a Palestinian refugee from Gaza, and Rebecca is an American Jewish woman who finds herself in Gaza and other places in the region, which I'll talk about in a bit. But the through line is their love story, and off of which I hang their backstories. His refugee family. He was a political prisoner held by the Israelis for 14 years, and her backstory as the daughter of a family that were refugees themselves at one point, Russian Jewish refugees who escaped pogroms and found their way to the United States. So it's a story of that type of love, but I also like to think that it's a love story of a different kind, or of many kinds, I should say. It's the love of ideals, the love of a place, the love of community, and what happens when some or all of those disintegrate or are destroyed by the forces that this couple encounters. And then what do you do next? How do you rebuild? And what type of relationships do you decide you want to have with the people in your life and the world around you after you face such trauma? In that way, the book actually started out, in full disclosure, as a memoir. But once my editor, whom I was assigned by Interlink Press, read the manuscript and sort of digested it and my style of writing, he said, you should think about fictionalizing this, because if you want a wider readership, that is, a readership beyond the people who normally read about politics or Israel-Palestine or the Middle East, someone who doesn't know or isn't interested in those topics, or maybe does know but needs to know more, will pick up a work of fiction, will be more likely to pick up a work of fiction than a work of nonfiction. So he kind of saw me through the process of fictionalizing it, And I'm really glad that I did, because it did allow me to tell a story, a wider story, that I think will appeal to people who aren't necessarily interested in the region or aren't necessarily interested in the politics, but know, the sense of loss from a quote unquote broken family, or who face, the challenges of a broken and opaque and unjust immigration system, or who are children of immigrants. So I will be in the debt of my editor for that suggestion for a very long time. So yeah, that's my novel, The Other End of the Sea.
So you have some questions from...
Yes, I do. So Zein and I have known each other since I lived in the DC area where Zein still lives. I lived there for 9 years. And we met at Bus Boys and Poets. I think where, you meet people like Zein. And we became fast friends. So I just first want to congratulate him on a really wonderful collection of stories. Stories that, as Zein said, take the reader many places, both geographically as well as emotionally. So, mabruk, ya amo. So, until now, you've published mainly poetry. And so, from a craft point of view, what was it like to move from writing poetry to writing short stories? And, did you feel that poetic sensibility kind of sitting on your shoulder when you were writing short stories, or did they come from a completely different part of your brain and maybe your heart?
I mean, essentially, I think of myself as a storyteller. And I never really intended to be just a poet, but what happens is by the way, I was a civil engineer for 20 years, and in 2007, I switched careers. I took a bunch of poems and short stories that I've already written, and one or two were published already, and I took them to the head of the English department, to Mike Collier, and I said, this is my work. Do you think I'm crazy if I drop a successful civil engineering career for creative writing, MFA? And he read it. He read the stuff, and he says, this stuff has potential. Within like 24 hours, he got back to me, and I was accepted into the MFA program before I was even accepted in the University of Maryland. I had to apply for the University of Maryland afterwards, but. But the problem is with MFA programs, and it was by the way, it was a great MFA program and still is, because the same people are still there. But the problem is that you either have to choose poetry or prose. You can't do both, which I felt constrained, and I, by default at the time, because I'd written more poems than short stories, by default I went into poetry. So when stories come up, some of them come up in like as poems, and some of them as short stories. And now, 2 stories that have come up that are novels that I'm working on right now, in a very schizophrenic way. But yeah, so. I never felt like, oh, I'm neglecting my craft, of poetry or anything. I just felt those stories came out, and the occasion came up, where I got a residency at Blue Mountain Center, which is really a great place, and I spent a month where I was being fed and exercised, and all I had to think about is writing. And at that time, I had brought a poetry manuscript that I finished, and I didn't. And then I brought like a handful of short stories that I haven't finished, and I decided that I'll do the short stories. So I basically finished and polished those 7 short stories, and then submitted them to that's the only place I submitted them to Radix Media, and I won the Megaphone Prize for short fiction that they were offering for the first time. And that was within a few months of me returning from Blue Mountain Center. So that's how the book came about. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if we're honest, these genre divisions are pretty, sketchy in my opinion anyway. Yeah. So they probably just serve publishers more than writers. But
right.
So in almost every story, Lebanon appears either in the background or really center stage. Fascinatingly, even in Killdeer, which is set on the eastern shore of Maryland, I believe, Lebanon is there.
Exactly.
And, you were essentially born and raised in Lebanon. I know you lived a somewhat cosmopolitan childhood, so to speak, but... And I don't know how many people here have ever been to Lebanon or know much about Lebanon, but what would you like people to know about, your home country, if I may call it that,
Sure.
And if I may not, let me know, from the book. And what does thinking about Lebanon in the ways that you present it teach us here, in this room, in this city, in this country, at this time in history?
Right. I'll start with the last part of your questions because and I'm sure some of you who write have experienced this, where you write a story or write a poem and you conclude in a certain way and it feels very honest and it's like the truth, and then the world changes. There's a war or disaster. In this case, it's Lebanon with multiple disasters, corruption, COVID, and an explosion in a port that was huge. And so I had written, for example, Is This How You Eat the Watermelon, with a happy ending, and because it all takes place in Beirut. And it was I wanted to showcase part of the many things I did, that I wanted to do with that story and with the other stories about Lebanon. But I wanted to showcase how eclectic Beirut is, especially when it comes to art and all that, and food, and of course. But by the time I finished the story, I thought I finished it, and then all these multiple disasters happened. Then I had to, the ending had to change. I read it as a reader, months later, and it didn't feel like the truth. It didn't feel honest, even though it's fiction. I think you probably know what I'm talking about. So it didn't feel honest. So that's why it has, I won't give it away, but it has the ending. I mean, even though the character is really, we know from the very beginning that he's a self-destructive character that's basically disintegrating and not listening to anybody. But that's why he's a stand-in for Beirut. But I also, in these stories, I don't really, I show a contrast. It wasn't like a thing I set out, it just happened. There's a contrast between, and it's a contrast you're familiar with, Alison. It's between the cosmopolitan Beirut, which when I was a little child, Beirut was lit up like Vegas, but at the same time, southern Lebanon, where home was, didn't even have running water or electricity. So a lot of the storytelling and the poetry and everything was part of the entertainment because there was no TV or anything else. But in the stories there is that contrast, and in the readings Alison and I are going to do, you'll see like the what we're talking about geographically. Yeah, so that's the other part, because it's, Lebanon is the size of Rhode Island, but it has like 5 different cuisines, like major differences in cuisines. It has different dialects. Like, the minute I open my mouth, people know I'm from South Lebanon because I have a southern drawl. Apparently, all Southerners have a certain drawl. So I have a drawl in my Arabic that people recognize. So yeah, that's what I wanted to. That's what came out basically about Lebanon. Yeah.
So the collection, as again you've touched on, deals with trauma and exile and war, but it also has very vibrant moments of humor and love and people creating community. Can you talk a bit about how these themes both weave together and play counterpoint to each other in the various stories?
Right. So I truly believe like that whimsy is the weapon, the best weapon for oppressed people when it comes to art, and that's why Palestinians are the funniest people I've known because of that it relates, it goes up with the degree of oppression, and the Lebanese also tend to laugh at catastrophe. I remember after the 2006 war is the subject of is sort of the title story takes place in the wake of that war, and I remember like one of the jokes was like because in the southern suburbs of Beirut, they were all residential, they were completely flattened by bunker busters, basically, that would go right to the shelter where people were hiding, and then when they hit it with the bunker buster, the whole building would collapse like a stack of pancakes. So they would hit it at the foundation. So in the Dahiya, in these southern suburbs, only a few buildings were left. To give you an idea, my uncle and my two cousins had 3 different houses at different apartment buildings that were like 10 minutes apart, and they all lost their homes in one day. But you still saw pictures of kids, raising the victory sign in the southern suburbs, and some people call that resilience, and we'll take that. But also, like the Lebanese were joking that the kids were indicating how many buildings were left, too. So that's part of. So humor, I couldn't, for example, the prison story. I couldn't tell the prison story because I didn't know how to differentiate it from any other prison story. Every time I told it at a social event, people say you should write it, but I said, when I was by myself, I thought, well, how is that going to differentiate from every other miserable prison story? Like how? So I need to give it some air to breathe within it, some wiggle room, and that's one day a student of mine indicated that there's something funny about the story, and once I found a little bit of humor, I was able to grab that story through that, and so yeah, whimsy and humor is always part of our culture, as Lebanese, as Palestinians, as Jews, that's why the Jewish comedians are so hilarious, because of the catastrophes that they've met historically. So that's what I do.
And we're all the better for it. So would you like to read
Sure.
now a little excerpt?
Testing works. So I'm going to read from a very short beginning of the title story. Is This How You Eat a Watermelon? Which was, by the way, was just published by, by Electric Literature. No, the Literary Hub published the Sharifi story. Yeah. So, Literary Hub published the Sharifi story. This all happened. This has been happening in the last few weeks. So, Literary Hub published the Sharifi story. Then after that, Electric Literature published the title story. And you can read those online, but don't let it stop you from buying the book.
It's sold out.
Pardon?
It's almost sold out.
Oh, really? Excellent.
Excellent.
We've had really amazing events at the Center for Fiction in New York so far. It was an incredible evening, and then we had a really great reading and a book launch in D.C. at the Eaton Hotel, which is like a boutique hotel that's owned by a billionaire progressive, apparently, who was in the trenches with us in the anti-globalization movement. And yeah, that was a theater, and we filled up the theater. It was really fantastic. So is this how you eat a watermelon? I'm going to read just a very short bit from the beginning of that story. The kidney was secured and the doctors were ready to operate on Ghassan the following morning. Not one, not two, but 3 doctors stand at the foot of his bed. Ghassan is tired and nauseous, but the sight of them amuses him. When they begin to talk, he narrows his eyes and melds the triplets into one body. The fact that their speech was rehearsed and sequenced for maximum effect, as if coordinated by one body and communicated by 3 heads, helps enhance the illusion. The doctors are channeling his older brother, Kamal, the Minister of Labor. He can see Kamal sitting in their office, knee over knee, his bodyguard stoic beside him, giving the 3-headed hydra stern instructions on how to approach Ghassan. You have to handle him like an adolescent. He's in his 40s, but he's a child, he might have said. Each doctor has dealt with Ghassan at one point or another in the past few years because of his various health crises: kidney failure, liver problems, diabetes, and high blood pressure. So they knew how to deal with him, but they would have been obliged to sit and listen and pretend to take notes out of fear of the minister. Ghassan loves his food, his drink, and his family, or shall we say families. His first wife was a Lebanese woman, Saad, a childhood friend who was always amused by Ghassan's carpe diem attitude that infuriated his family. She saw this as innocence, not immaturity, nor recklessness, and adored him for it. She gave him 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl. Ghassan was in his element when he was with the children. It allowed him to roll on the carpet, play in the mud, be a ravenous eater, and liberate his inner Tasmanian devil. This caused problems sometimes, especially during weekends spent in the south, in their home village of Swanee. Having the wilderness nearby with its climbable fig trees, abandoned forts, hidden wells, renegade beehives, scorpions, and snakes raised the risk of Ghassan's antics. However, he did not need to leave the house and put himself at risk. He can do wild all by himself. Take, for example, the watermelon incident. One day, Ghassan was sitting playing checkers with his youngest daughter, Huda, who was 7 at the time. They were in the courtyard of Ghassan's ancestral village home and were using the backside of backgammon box to play. Saad brought out a tray of watermelon slices. It was a June afternoon of bearable dry heat, so they sat in the cool shade of an old lemon tree that arced over them, laden with fruit. Ghassan looked up and saw Huda nibbling along the top of this red semicircle of a slice that dwarfed her face. "Is this how you eat a watermelon?" he asked. She looked at him, puzzled, and waited for clarification. "Is this how you eat a watermelon?" he repeated. She started to worry as he was not using his usual terms of endearment. Then he added, "Do you eat it like this?" and imitated her nibbling. Huda looked back at her mother for help and caught her stifling a laugh. Do you eat a big slice of watermelon like a bird, like this? Nom, 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 nom. He pecked at his slice with his nose, pinkies raised. Huda broke into a smile that prompted Ghassan to explain, you eat it like this, like a goat. And Ghassan went into typewriter mode, chomping wildly at the slice from one end to another, watermelon seeds flying left and right. So Daddy's girl took the tip and ran with it, imitating him, putting her whole face into her slice of watermelon, filling her mouth and nostrils with it, digging in deeper until the rind curved up around her face. She looked up at her father with a long red smile that extended up to her ears, watermelon seeds entangled in her curls. He rewarded her with a pat on the back and a kiss on top of the head. 2 days later, the family was back in Beirut. They arrived late at night and Suad put the kids to bed. She returned to check in on them and noticed that Huda was snoring. She joked about it with Ghassan. She's even taking on your snore, God help us. A week later, Huda was feverish and was having difficulties breathing at night. They called the family doctor and he diagnosed her with asthma and prescribed some holistic treatments, including weekends in the mountains. But 2 weeks later, Huda was still laboring with her breath day and night, so they took her back to the doctor. This time the doctor located the problem with a cursory examination. There's a seed lodged up her left nostril, he told Ghassan with a smile and a shake of his head. The damn thing is sprouting. The doctor anticipated Ghassan's accustomed hearty laugh, but Ghassan just stood there with a look of terror on his face. I can take it out right now without putting her under, the doctor added. Ghassan crouched in front of Huda, pinched her cheek and said, It won't hurt, Habibti. The procedure took less than half an hour. The doctor put the extracted seed in a jar and told Ghassan that he should keep it to preserve this memory for her. Years later, when Huda will leave home to attend Lebanese American University, she will take the jar with her. See? So now Alison's going to read a piece that sort of speaks with my piece too. Both include red fruit.
Yes. And father's legacies to their daughters. So this is near the end of my book, and just to give you a little context, Zein and Rebecca, whom I spoke about earlier, are no longer living together. They have a daughter named Amira, and Rebecca has brought Amira back. Zein is now in Lebanon. As many Palestinian refugees experience, he's essentially been chased from country to country. He's now working in Lebanon as a journalist. Rebecca and their daughter Amira are living in the States, but Rebecca has taken Amira back to Lebanon to visit her father for the first time in several years. And Amira is around 10 years old. He's based in Beirut, but they're going with friends to the south of Lebanon to visit a friend's family. And the village in southern Lebanon is Naqoura. You'll hear that mentioned. And Nabil is the name of the person whose ancestral village they're visiting. Soon we were in Naqoura. The town was the headquarters of the United Nations Interim Forces in Lebanon, or UNIFIL, first established in 1978 to confirm the withdrawal of Israeli forces after their first invasion. 2 more followed, and the UNIFIL mandate was adjusted accordingly. Nabil's family lived in a sleepy village outside of the main town. Ambient sounds were as likely to come from crowing roosters or braying donkeys as they were from cars. Old stone houses and newer ones, the color of biscuits, stood watch over clusters of olive trees. Nabil maneuvered through the village road, the SUV's girth hanging over the side like a middle-aged paunch. We pulled into a clearing next to a simple stone house. An old woman sitting on a stool outside struggled to her feet. She smiled, turned toward the house, and appeared to say something to someone inside. Nabil hopped out of the car and waved to her, smiling the same smile. Marhaba ya ma, ahlan wa sahlan ya ibni, ahlan wa sahlan, welcome my son. Her voice, scratched with age, drifted toward us. We got out of the car and unloaded the food Nabil brought. His sister Amina appeared in the doorway, nodding and wiping her hands on a towel. Nabil introduced us and then brought chairs from the house and arranged them on a patio under the shade of a large mulberry tree. It scattered fruit, leaving red stains like tiny paw prints on the stone tiles. We drank cold juice while Zein and Nabil prepared the barbecue. After a meal of glistening meats grilled with tomatoes and onions, sweetened by the charcoal heat, everyone settled under the tree with glasses of mint tea. What is the name of this tree in Arabic? I asked Zein. Tut, he replied, eyeing the other men lighting up cigarettes, which he had given up in the intervening years. Nabil looked up at the tree and smiled. I had already moved to Beirut when the Israelis invaded in 1982. During my last visit here before the invasion, this tree was just a sapling, not much taller than Amira is now. He took a long drag on his cigarette. It was impossible to visit my parents during the entire time of the occupation. When I was finally able to visit in 2000, after the Israelis withdrew, the tree had grown up. Nabil sat up in his chair and raised his hand above his head, like a parent bragging about a child's growth spurt. I couldn't believe it when I saw it, he sighed, leaning back again and shaking his head. 18 years. After the tea and then Arabic coffee, we got back in the car and headed a bit farther south. Ras al-Naqoura, the head of Naqoura, was the Lebanon-Israel border point where UNIFIL troops were stationed to monitor the no man's land between the countries. On a map, the southwest border of Lebanon is shaped like a nose. Ras al-Naqoura is its tip. Within a few minutes of leaving the village, signs appeared, replete with skull and crossbones, warning drivers about the possibility of off-road mines. The road ended at a white metal gate. A UNIFIL guard station stood behind it about 10 feet away. We got out of the car and stood in silence. Beyond the gate, beyond the UNIFIL soldier, from Fiji or Nepal or India, was Palestine. Zein lifted Amira onto his shoulders and pointed. That's Philistine, Baba, he said. And was silent again. This was the closest they'd ever been to being there together. Seeing the country from this side was like looking in your own window. There was a gauzy familiarity, but an unmistakable distance. The red-tiled roofs of the Rosh Hanikra kibbutz stood out among the greenness of the trees and the blueness of the sea. 22 years earlier, I had been in Kiryat Yam, 20 miles south, and 100 miles beyond that, at the other end of the sea, was Gaza.
You know what they say, no tear in the poet, no tear in the reader, right?
I hadn't read that piece publicly. I should have probably practiced it before.
No, it's a good piece. That's why you're reading it as a reader. No, but that place is a very emotional place.
Yeah.
When in the year 2000, the occupation that Alison talked about, I was standing on top of a fort in a noticed that there's like a bombing, but it's happening like where there's planes are, but they're retreating, like going down towards Palestine, and we didn't know what was going on. And then we heard ululations, like which is celebration, and we realized that the Israelis are withdrawing after a 22-year occupation. And we did what crazy Lebanese do, which you follow the bombing. We got in the car and we just drove, and we got to witness this retreat, which was very joyous. Every time we got into a village square, there would be Muslim clerics and Christian priests dancing, and people throwing rice, and like people from the village dancing and ululating and singing and all of that. And we got to the border, and then for the first time we got to see our Palestinian brothers on the other side, and I can't tell you how moving that was. And it was a bittersweet moment because the Lebanese arrived there and they're like happy and joyous and they've been liberated, and then they like looking across to their Palestinian brothers and sisters across the way, and they're saying "Atbela," which means your day will come. Yeah. May your day come. And it was just very emotional moment. So that's why I understand the emotion.
Thank you. Yeah. There've been films made about, the fence and that border, which there's a filmmaker from the audience, she probably knows. I mean, and again, think about the wider world that we live in, the emotionality, the cruelty, the striving for hope at borders, of this country, and what that's meant the past, many, many years, but certainly the past several. Just the evocative image that separation, barriers, and what people need to do to sort of try to overcome, at least in their minds, if not in their bodies, crossing those borders and those boundaries. But, yeah.
Thank you, Alison. Well, so should we open it for Q&A?
I think so.
Any questions?
Comments, observations.
Yes.
Wedding in Galilee was a movie about that border by Michelle about the difficulty of Palestinians to marry other people, cross the border marriage, but it was committed something.
Yeah.
Yeah, Wedding in Galilee is one movie that deals with that issue, right. Is what Heather was saying.
Yeah, and what's unique about it is that Wedding in Galilee deals with even like how, when you're under occupation, you can never escape that, even in your wedding bed, basically. It permeates that and it affects that moment too,
Yes, it's called The Other End of the Sea. Yes, it's a novel. But draws heavily from my own experience living there, but it's a fictionalized version of that. Published by Interlink Press, which is a press that publishes a lot about the Global South, and it's based in Northampton, Mass. A Palestinian publisher, and it's available for sale.
And Interlink was bought by Simon & Schuster?
Interlink wasn't exactly, no, it wasn't. They have a distribution deal with Simon & Schuster that happened right before my book came out. So hopefully Simon & Schuster's distribution prowess will help just distribute Interlink's books a little better.
Hi, I have a question for you. I know you said that you write a lot of poetry. Did you struggle to go from writing poetry that's short to then writing the short stories that become a book?
No, because I was like, I was always writing short stories, not as much, and I just felt it wasn't a struggle; it was an easy transition, and also like I noticed that that my short stories are infused with my poetry, and vice versa. Yeah.
I had a kind of similar question though, but for Alison, since you were asking before I knew that your publisher had encouraged you to fictionalize your memoir. And I just really was curious about what that process was for you. What were some of the most difficult things about that for you?
Thank you. Yes. Well, when he first suggested it, I totally freaked out because I had always thought of myself as a nonfiction writer. That's all I had ever written. And so, he said, I'm not talking about a total rewrite, but you have a literary writing style that just comes naturally. So I'm talking about reading through the manuscript and just identifying bits and pieces as you read that that instinctively resonate with you. Images, characters, places, and mark those, and then go back and think about how you can expand on those in a way that makes the narrative more accessible, again, to a wider readership, or maybe surfaces issues that kind of lie underneath that would expand the narrative. I think, and I can talk about one specific example very briefly, because I know that's kind of, what is she talking about? So in the book, there are two stones that appear. Rebecca and Zein marry in Gaza, and 3 weeks later he's arrested by the Israelis and put under what's called administrative detention, which is detention without charge or trial. And he's in prison for 6 months. And when he comes out, he presents her with two stones that someone has carved in this prison that was literally in the Negev desert, where he had, lived in a tent with a bunch of other prisoners. And that really happened. I was married to a Palestinian from Gaza. 3 weeks after we were married, he was arrested and imprisoned. And he gave me these stones. One was a heart and one was a map of Palestine that had been carved. Actually not by him, but by another prisoner. So I took that's in the original memoir manuscript. That's the only place where those stones appear. I mean, I think they make one brief appearance. In the novelized version, in the fictionalized version, Zein is the carver of those stones. And they reappear 3 more times in the novel. Once after Zein has gone into exile and they're living in Yarmouk refugee camp in Damascus. Another time when Rebecca gives the stones to their daughter, Amira, right before the trip to Lebanon that I just read about. And at the very end, when Amira is crossing into Palestine for the first time by herself. So I was able to create these characters, these inanimate objects, and give them a narrative arc that I think really works in this story. So that's the type of stuff I couldn't have been able to do.
And that's the wedding is one of those. There's many places where I was laughing out loud, but the wedding is quite comical. Maybe you should say a little bit about it. The fact that the cleric had to be brought in an ambulance.
Yeah. So yeah, Zein and Rebecca's wedding scene. The first Intifada, the first Palestinian uprising, breaks out while Rebecca is there, actually before she even meets Zein. But their romance kind of follows a bit the track of the first Intifada, and they end up getting married at the height of the Intifada in Gaza. And the date that happens to be chosen is it turns out to be a general strike day. So there's no transportation allowed on the roads of Gaza, and it's enforced, by the young activists. The only vehicles that are allowed on the streets are UN officer cars that kind of monitor the situation in the way that the UN does, and ambulances. So when they realize this, they have to arrange to bring the sheikh who's going to perform the marriage in an ambulance. He takes, the sheikh doesn't really know what he's getting into. All he knows is that, Hilmi Musa or Zein Majdalawi wants to get married. So he's brought, and he takes one look at Rebecca and says in Arabic, Gaza is full of women, and the only person you can find to marry is a foreigner. And of course, Rebecca speaks fluent Arabic and understands, which the sheikh doesn't know. But at the end of the ceremony, which he sort of begrudgingly performs, the bride and groom are then taken off in an ambulance. So, yeah, it was, yeah.
I mean, it's for those of you who might know Arabic, Alison speaks with the Palestinian in the Palestinian colloquial, and I can't even really, if I close my eyes, I wouldn't be able to tell that it's a foreigner. She has no accent, so she's actually like in real life when the cleric was commenting about this, she knew exactly, and later she responds to him in Arabic at the end of this, and he's like shocked.
Yeah. Other questions?
You both talked about sort of crossing between genres and reflecting to some extent on how that experience affects what you're writing. I wonder if you could say more about your reflections on that. I mean, Alison, you said something at one point like these divisions are really more for publishers than they are for writers, but exactly how relative do you think these boundaries between genres really are?
I'll answer this in a roundabout way. Najwan Darwish, the Palestinian poet who wrote the excellent book "Exhausted on the Cross," which is one of the best titles for a book of poetry. But I was reading an interview with him that they conducted with him the other day, and he was like, because poetry is such a part of our culture in the oral tradition, and especially in the family that I grew up with, they were all poets. All four boys were named by a poet who would basically come in and look at my mother as she's carrying the child. They would call him. He was actually my uncle. Just to give you an idea how ingrained poetry is. He would come in and he was wearing Ray-Ban glasses. in like a reservoir dog suits, like those suits with the skinny ties, and he would come in and he would look at the baby and he would like, Zein, and then they would say, why? And they would say, well, Zein El-Amine was a leader, in the wars and all that. So he's the first one. We're going to call him Zein. So Bilal was born, and he goes like, he looks at him, and he's darker, and he says Bilal, and they understand why, because Bilal was the first black man to join Islam, and then the third one was Rayyan, and he looks like a Cabbage Patch doll, and he looks at him, and he's like Rayyan, and they say, well, this is like an obscure classic Arabic word that they didn't even know. And they looked at him puzzled, and they said, oh, Rayyan, meaning soft as a cucumber. Like pliable, but not too soft. And then Rami, he named him after his favorite, after our family's favorite poet at the time, which was Ahmad Rami. But anyway, it's so ingrained, like with us. And when some people look at the, like Najwan Darwish looks at the fact that now we're writing novels, like people like me. No, I mean, he wasn't commenting about me. He doesn't even know me. But I'm saying, like in general, that writing a novel is a betrayal. Like that. It's like now they're copying Western writers, and writing novels, like longer things. And I still love Najwan, but it's like I don't agree with him on this. I think that the short story, there is the class. One of the when you ask people to pick their top books in Arabic, like when you ask academics or readers in general, they would talk about Tayyib Saleh, the Sudanese author who wrote Season of Migration to the North in the early 60s, I guess it was published. But he also wrote short stories too. He wrote his novels first, then short stories. But throughout his novels, you'll see poetry, and so like it is. For example, we have the novel that was introduced by Naguib Mahfouz, the Egyptian writer, was like the first time. This is the Egyptian writer that won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and people felt that was the introduction of the novel into the Arabic literature canon, basically like an introduction of the novel, and it was seen as a Western import, not in a bad way. It was just seen like now we have the modern novel too, and so on and so forth. So that's how this whole thing. And just another thing that explains it, like when I approached my teacher in elementary school in like 5th grade, and when I talked to him about writing poetry, he basically, instead of encouraging me, he basically said, oh, you're going to write poetry, you have to know this rule, you have to use this meter, this rhyme scheme, this thing. This is traditional Arabic poetry that basically people like Adonis, poets later that have actually rebelled against it. And he basically discouraged me from writing poetry by saying that. It's like, oh, like I went to him to get resources, and said he loaded me with boulders, and I'm like, I went, oh, this is just too much. And then when I went to an international school, an American international school in Saudi Arabia, my teachers were actually really like world-wise American and British teachers that have traveled widely and everything. So when I approached my English teacher about writing poetry, and she goes, okay. Like simply okay. It's like, oh, you're not going to load me up with... No, write whatever you want. Write free verse, write rhyme, whatever you want. And I go, okay. So I was freed to do that. So that's just some background. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I don't have such an interesting answer. But, I mean, I was really forced to think a lot about, what's true, what's real, and presenting it to the world as that or as something else, who does that serve? And as a writer and as someone who, tries to take my craft seriously, how does what I want to write and how I write it serve the story and the book that I want to put out in the world? But so, that's one aspect of it. What's the best way to tell this story? And as I said earlier, that will reach a wider readership. But I also think about it, thanks in part to, other people in my life, especially my daughter, to think about it from a perspective of power relationships. When I was telling this story or writing this story, I had to think about, okay, who are you, this, white, middle-class Jewish woman living in the United States of America? How are you going to tell this story in a way that is, legitimate and something that I can be proud of and take responsibility for? So I had to think very seriously about whose story I was telling. And that, that led me to think about other writers who are kind of flipping the script on this, fiction and nonfiction. And most specifically, I think of Saidiya Hartman, Wayward Lies, Beautiful Experiments. She's an academic teaching at, is it Barnard or Columbia? Anyway, she's an academic, and she has written books, academic books, that basically take the stories of women, many of whom came to Philadelphia from the South, sort of post-Reconstruction, to try to make lives as black women, right? But because the archives, the scholarly archives, you don't find archival material on these women, right? Because they are the most marginalized, disenfranchised, oppressed people in society by and large. So she basically said, okay, I'm going to read what I can about their lives, which was basically things like arrest records, records from social welfare organizations who had, taken these women's children away, etc. Taken these bits and pieces of nonfiction material and told their stories in essentially a narrative format, imagining what their lives would be, because she said, I'm not going to, as a scholar, not allow these women's lives to be represented. So this is a example of somebody who did just the opposite, who is very much at the center of kind of academic power in this country, but who says, I'm going to challenge what the archives say. I'm going to say that, a narrative approach to telling the stories of these lives are just as legitimate as, a nonfiction scholarly tome that is published by any academic press in this country. Again, I don't know if that answers the question, but I think these are questions that we need to think about both as writers and as readers.
I'd be amiss if not mention the tradition, the Arabic tradition of the Hakawati, which is the storyteller. And the Hakawati traditionally was somebody on a Friday night or Saturday night, or in that case like Thursday night, would be sitting in the corner of the tea shop, and they have like a little raised podium, and he would sit there and he would tell stories, and people would drink tea and coffee and listen. That was the evening entertainment. And that's what, when I was, these stories, when I think about this book tour that I'm doing, that's the persona that I'm taking, is the Hakawati. I'm interested in being the Hakawati sitting in the corner of a tea shop telling stories. And that's the mode that these stories came out in, that not in poetry, but rather in story. So That's what I would tell Najwan Darwish is like, the Hakawati is like told really long stories, really. And those were basically could have been novels or anything. So these things existed. And prose did exist before, as alongside poetry. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you, Making Worlds. And we'll be going out to one of these, a couple of people want to go out afterwards, so we're going to go to Menaish or someplace else to eat and chat informally.